I am pleased to be joined by Dr. Leigh Anderson, Executive Director of the Police Accountability Team, Chief Dorothy Todd of the Cleveland Police, and Dr. Tanaya Devi, co-founder and Chief Data Scientist with Sigma Squared. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Dr. Devi, I want to start with you first, please. Can you explain in simple terms what you were testing for when you looked for bias?
So I'll give a slightly higher level overview first and then go into bias. So the way we understand biased decision making is first we do something called raw disparities. So what are raw disparities? Raw disparities are basically what most police departments look at. They say, all right, if we're trying to understand searches or trying to understand contraband hit rates across two populations, we look at the total number of black civilians who were stopped and then searched, total number of white civilians that were stopped and searched, and we look at differences in the numbers. So for example, if I say 30% black civilians were searched among all stopped and white civilians, only 20% were searched, raw disparities would say 30% versus 20%, there is a disparity. That's the first level. What this is not doing is doing the second thing, which is, black civilians and white civilians may be in completely different contextual environments. They could be in different locations, they could be at different times of day, there could be different reasons to stop them. So the second layer is supposed to be a control disparity. Control disparity says, let's look at the same thing, but let's try and see if we can compare apples to apples. So let's imagine that you were stopping two people, one black, one white, but both of them in the exact same situation, same location, same city, everything. Then is the black person more likely to be searched compared to the white person? So that is a control disparity, starting to look more at apples to apples comparison. The third layer, which is the one you asked, is how do you test for bias here? So with bias, what we do, that is a much stricter level of understanding what's happening in searching decisions. It says, was the same standard applied during searching decisions of black and white population? How do we understand if the same standard was applied? So this is coming from a bunch of literature in economics and social science. There's a particular test called the hit rate test. So the hit rate test says, if you were using the exact same standards to search black and white population or female and male population, then conditional on being searched, contraband hit rates should be found at the same rate. So the contraband hit rate test should say it's the same exact thing for black and white population. If I find that the contraband hit rate for black population is vastly lower than the white population, that just means that you did a bunch of searches for black people, but that didn't lead to a lot of contraband hit rate or contraband being found. The success rate of those searches is pretty low. So you just did a lot of searches and that didn't lead to a lot of evidence being found on them. So that's the first type of test. It understands if the hit rate is the same across different groups, because if the same standard of searching was being used, it would be the same. The second test is called a threshold hit rate test. So what is a threshold test? Threshold test says, what is the standard at which somebody starts to get searched? So we start to look at different features in the data and start to understand what is the feature at which somebody starts to get searched? And is that the same across all different types of populations? If that is the same, we say it's the same threshold at which people start getting searched, regardless of the race and gender. So it's the hit rate test and the threshold test and things like that that help us understand bias in decision making.
Dr. Devi, what did you find when you tested whether different groups were held to different standards?
For Cleveland, when we looked as a whole, for the data set that we looked as a whole, we found that none of the groups were failing the hit rate test, the contraband hit rate test, or the threshold test, regardless of race or gender. Again, overall, when you look at searches, these tests do not fail.
Okay, thank you for that.
Although I will add, just as an addition to it, disparities, control disparities in search rates do show up, but when we take the stricter bias test on hit rate and threshold on searches, that does not fail on any race or gender.
Thank you for that. Dr. Anderson, I want to turn to you now. What is the most important takeaway you want the public to understand from this report?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we need to underscore is that the consent decree, which we are currently underneath, requires us to look at this data, right? And so we looked at this data about maybe about a year and a half ago, and we found the disparities that Dr. Devi is talking about, right? But we weren't sure if bias existed. And so we wanted to start looking to see who we can have help us determine as an outside party what bias looks like and if it exists in the city of Cleveland. With that said, we also understand that the Federal Monitor was doing a report, right? And so they have to basically grade us on how we're doing in these particular areas of the consent decree. So we received a 2025 assessment from the monitoring team, and what they noted was that 95% of the stops were constitutional, and those that were not were identified properly by the chain of command and were addressed properly. And so one of the things that I would like for the community to know is that we have been looking at this issue for quite some time. And we jumped into action to see, is there bias, right? Once we looked at the disparity and looked at the numbers that were there, right? We wanted to make sure that we brought in a third party to be able to help us determine whether or not, we needed to make some additional adjustments to training, policies, and implementations.
So for the public, how can we make sure they understand the difference between the disparities and the bias that wasn't found in the report?
Yeah, I can answer that.
Okay.
So this is just the differences between disparities and bias.
Yes.
So what we do is, if you take control disparities, what we're saying is let's try and take Black civilians and white civilians in the same context and try and understand if one was searched more than the other. The problem is that you can never control for all context. You're not seeing everything that the police officer is seeing because stop forms can't be long enough to add all of the context in. So disparities are great to look at. Control disparities especially are great to look at to understand if there are differences in decision making, but they don't give the entire picture. That's why we come into the bias land. So basically all of these tests, there's a Nobel Prize winning economist, Gary Becker. He started this understanding of bias, and he said that, okay, this was way back in 1993 when he was winning the Nobel Prize, that he said, if we're trying to understand why the lending rate for Black civilians and white civilians looks different, for Black subjects and white subjects look different, it's like we don't know exactly what the loan officer is seeing. We don't know all of the variables that he's seeing, all of the information he's seeing to make this type of information on who should be given a loan versus who can't be given a loan. And he says, let's not look at that because we'll never know all of the information. What we can look at is conditional on giving a loan, were the repayment rates the same? Because if the repayment rate from a Black person and a white person is exactly the same, then it's fine. They're making all of the calculations to make sure that the repayment rate across all of these demographics is fine. However, if I find that the repayment rate of Black people is much higher, then I should be giving them much more number of loans. So he shifted the understanding and he said, instead of trying to understand if we have all of the information, why don't we look at the outcome exactly after the decision was made? If you're doing decisions in the right way, then the outcome post-decision should look exactly the same across different demographic groups. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Chief Todd, what do these findings mean for the Division of Police?
I think this is just another testament of the work that the men and women are doing. We have been under consent decree for 11 years, and our current operations, our policies and trainings have been implemented. Changes have been made, and now they're just doing the work. And this is just another assessment for us that checks a box that says, look, we are doing it. We've implemented, we've made these changes, and we're hoping this is another way that the community understands the work and sees a level of commitment from the Division of Police.
Then with the report, do you still see changes in training and policy, even supervision? See that all changing going forward?
We're always going to change. With how policing is in 2026 to where it was when the consent decree started, policing has changed dramatically. And our policies and our training will continue to be upgraded to the best practices. And this is a partnership that we've established so that we can get these reports more in real time so that we can continue to monitor, to assess how we're doing, to see if changes need to be made.
Dr. Anderson, how does this analysis fit into the city's broader accountability work and the monitoring team's assessment?
Sure. So the monitoring team's assessment, I think it's important to note that they studied 2024 data, which is the same data that Sigma Squared looked at. And they produced a report in December of 2025. And what that report basically underlined or underscored was that 95% of the stops were constitutional, right? And so one of the reasons why the consent decree is here is because they found in the Department of Justice, found in their investigation that CDP officers were not following constitutional practices when it came to stops, right? And so now we see that over 90%, in fact, 95% of those stops are constitutional now. So we understand that the policies, the training, the implementation is working, right? So we are watching reform happen, right, in real time. And I think one of the things that we also have to underscore is that the disparities exist and we don't ignore them, right? We look at them, we research them, we examine them, and we work together to figure out why is that the case, right? Is it a quality of life issue? Is it hotspot policing, right? Is it just we're going to where the number of calls are concentrated, right? And so as Dr. Devi said, it's really hard to sort of pinpoint why disparities exist, because we all have our own implicit biases, right? But we understand that it's not happening on a systemic level within the division or a process level within the division. And so what we now have to do is look at the relationship between the community and the police officers. And that is exactly what we're doing.
So what comes next? In other words, how can the city keep building on this work, keep changing as they go into the future?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really important is that we have this report, right? But as Chief Todd mentioned, this is not the end. So Sigma Square is actually a software that lets Chief Todd know in real time if biases are existing in the data. So we have a data team that works within the Division of Police, and they look at the data, they bring it in from all of the officers' reports, they assess the information, analyze it, and then what we end up finding is that there are additional auditing practices that happen inside of the division as well, right? And so in addition to sort of this external monitor, the Bureau of Compliance, within the division also does random checks, right? Body camera footage, looking at stops to make sure that it continues to be within policy, within training, and making sure that if any adjustments need to be made, that they are addressed. The last thing that I'll say is that we were just fortunate enough to receive a grant from Kent State University. And so it's a joint grant between the mayor's office of the police accountability team and the Kent State, their sociology and criminology department. And one of the things that we're going to be working on is just this part, right? The disparities, the relationships, why are the concentration of stops in a particular area? Why is there a concentration of searches in a particular area? What does that tell us, right? So we're going to be going out into the community this summer. We've already started creating the survey. We're going to be knocking on doors. We're going to be holding forums because we want to understand more about this. And this is something that is not present really in the literature because, again, as Dr. Devi said, there are different reasons why people engage in stops, right? But as long as they're all following the rules and looking at procedural justice, that makes sense, right? But we still want to dig into if there are any implicit biases that we can catch and we can address.
Dr. Anderson, Chief Todd, Dr. Devi, I want to thank you all for joining me today. Great information, great to share.
Thank you so
Dan.
much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.